There were things like death threats and, things like that were going on. It's sort of, you're a communist, I hope you die, or, and threats and so on.
Marine scientist Ove Hoegh-Guldberg pioneered research in the 1990s on how global heating would soon threaten the world's coral reefs, one of the planet's richest ecosystems. What is it, Ove, about coral reefs that you fell in love with?
Well, I don't know exactly what turned me on, but what I did know that is in 1969, when people were going to the moon, and it was all terribly exciting. I got my first chance to go to the Great Barrier Reef when I was 10, and it was sort of transformative. When I first went into the water on the first afternoon, I didn't get out for 6 hours, and I came out like a big wrinkly prune. But it was just, this, the love of my life. And I had no idea that down the line we'd be seeing this system start to change to a point where this might be eliminated from tropical coastlines worldwide, and the implications of that.
So how did you come to researching corals, and specifically corals and temperature, and this thing we now know as coral bleaching?
Well, in the early 1980s, I went to do my PhD at UCLA in California. In the early 80s, they'd noticed that corals around the world were, small patches of coral, maybe a couple of acres, were turning white. And so one of the questions that was on everyone's mind was, well, what's happening here? Why are the corals going white? And is it a problem? As part of my PhD, I did experiments to try and find out how you could simulate or trigger bleaching. And what came out resoundingly was temperature, a couple of degrees above the sort of summer maximum, and you start to see corals bleach.
What actually is coral bleaching?
To understand corals, you've got to understand that they actually have little tiny single-celled organisms living inside them called dinoflagellates. And they provide the energy from sunlight to the host, who provides nutrients, ammonia and phosphate, back to the dinoflagellates. But then suddenly this thing where, corals are turning white, and if you look in the tissues, you realize that the algae are being spat out. And so after a lot of study of that system and so on, we began to understand that this was due to temperature. And it was very unusual. If you look back in time, that prior to the 1980s, you don't see any major bleaching events that's been reported in the scientific literature. And that's been steadily increasing over the last several decades. And there's very little else to explain it. I mean, you do the experiments in the lab, you look at the correlations from satellites and so on. It's high temperature that's doing this. Now, why?
When do you first start to really worry about corals in a warming world?
I guess the critical point is where sea temperatures rise to a point where the corals experience stressful conditions every year or every couple of years. At that point, you get corals dying faster than they can be recovered. Now, it takes about 15 to 20 years for a coral reef to recover. So if you're hitting them every year and back-to-back bleaching events, you're not going to have a coral reef. This year we're starting to see globally conditions which may have very big impacts on reefs. And it is really a big impact when you think about the scale of the habitat. When you're talking hundreds of square kilometres of coral reef habitat, you think of those, million species. This is a resource which will disappear. You potentially lost billions of dollars in terms of potential, development of pharmaceuticals from coral reefs. If you take the toxins out of a single cone shell, it has spawned a number of companies that have developed, heart and blood pressure medicines. It's a really, really big resource which we're going to really miss if we don't find a way around this problem.
So we have this big bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef in 1998. Other reefs around the world are also bleaching. I think it's only a year after you publish a paper where you've started to try and work out what might this mean for the future of reefs.
It was sort of a timely paper in that respect. But one of the things I did do was to sort of try and answer the question, how long before these warming seas, before it's a crisis in coral reefs? Well, the first modelling, putting together, there's the sea temperature doing this, here's what we know the corals can survive, was in a couple of decades, which really surprised me. I thought, I must have made a mistake.
So you think it's a problem that we might have to deal with in 100 years, but the data's telling you something different?
Got a little bit of variability between the different models, but largely by 2040, they were saying we were going to have, the loss of coral reefs because we know that they're not surviving these heating events. And now you're getting them every year. I didn't believe it. I was like, oh no, that's not possible. So redid the analysis. I talked to the climate people that were giving me the support in terms of the models. And sure enough, no matter what way you cut it, you got, sort of bleaching events every year by 2040, 2050.
So can you explain why corals in particular are so susceptible to global heating?
Well, I think corals are more susceptible, I think, than many other types of organisms for the idea that you've got a symbiosis, one organism living inside the cells of another. That's a knife edge type existence where, there's enormous benefits to operating in this narrow setting, with one cell inside the other and all that complexity. So when you start to change the temperature, you start to change the rate of different processes. But they don't all change in unison. And so when you change the temperature, it only has to be, 1 degree warmer than the summer maxima for about 6 weeks before you get a bleaching event.
You are working really hard in the early 2000s to convince people of the science. And you do become a bit of a bête noire, certainly of some high-profile media commentators. You're being called an alarmist, you're being attacked.
Yeah.
Here we go again, Ove Hoegh-Guldberg.
I have consulted Ove Hoegh-Guldberg and the alarmist David Suzuki, and have a look what they say. They say there's been a devastating effect so far from warming on the reef already.
How do you as a scientist cope when you're essentially under attack in that way? Do you take it personally?
Well, there was an element of that, right? There was an element of in two ways. One was that I didn't feel like I was doing enough because I wasn't getting the point across. And at the same time, the second part of it was that, well, what if I was wrong? The bottom line was that I was emboldened rather than that. And so, there were things like death threats and, things like that were going on. It's sort of, you're a communist, I hope you die, or, and threats and so on.
You're a softly spoken marine biologist interested in the symbiotic relationship between corals and
Exactly.
this.
I like sea slugs.
Yeah. You've known this problem of coral bleaching for almost 40 years.
Yeah.
How have you personally coped with that burden, if it is a burden?
You can almost twist it on its head and say, well, it was really nice to have a mission, right? But the bad part of that statement, I guess, is that there's no good solution at the moment, so it's a fight that we're losing. We are embarking with policies that are really not sufficient to solve the problem. So if you take all of the dedications, the promises, the emission reduction opportunities and apply them across all countries, you still are on the track to 3 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial period.
What's that mean for coral reefs?
There's very difficult to see anything else but a catastrophe developing. So yeah, how do you cope? Well, you've got to keep on fighting. You've got to, be in there with the boots on and stuff. There's still stuff to do to solve the problem. For example, we did a study recently that asked, if you took 7 sectors of activities in the ocean, human activities in the ocean, putting floating renewable is sort of wind, or revolutionising the transport of vessels. So you have hydrogen motors or whatever. You did all these sort of things. You can actually take up to half of the emissions you need to reduce to get on that 1.5 degrees Celsius track. That, to me, again, was an aha moment. And sometimes I talk to students, about the world in which they are sort of inheriting from the rest of us. And I say, look, these are tricky problems, really, tricky problems. But the technology we have today is escalating and may give us solutions when we really apply ourselves, like the things, pulling them off the shelf and applying them. We've just got to get on with it.
Take me 40 years now into the future. I'm going to the Great Barrier Reef. What am I going to see?
I think you'll find a place that will be either sort of marginal but growing back, because once you've stabilised things you can, or completely and utterly decimated. Because if we don't take care to protect corals from other factors, other stresses, then they won't be given the chance to get to grow back. And we've got to think about this as multi-generational responses that we need to commit to. We can't just live for the moment.